Welcome, fellow wanderer of the wasteland, to the extraordinary tale of a man who defied nuclear apocalypse through sheer brilliance and unshakable will. Tonight, we explore the complete saga of Robert Edwin House, visionary, autocrat, and self-proclaimed savior of New Vegas. This is the story of a mind so calculating it predicted Armageddon itself, and so determined it refused to let even global annihilation derail its ambitions. So settle in, let the desert winds carry away your worries, and drift into peaceful slumber as we chronicle the rise, fall, and eternal vigil of Mr. House, the man who made the house always win. The child who would reshape the post-apocalyptic world entered it during humanity's final century of innocence, born on June 25, 2020, in the neon-bright heart of Las Vegas, Nevada. Robert Edwin House arrived in a world that still believed in its own permanence, where the greatest concerns were economic fluctuations and political scandals, rather than the existential mathematics of mutual annihilation. His birth coincided with humanity's last golden age, though none could know that the infant drawing his first breath in a Las Vegas hospital would one day calculate the precise moment when that golden age would end in nuclear fire. The House family occupied a position of comfortable prosperity in pre-war Las Vegas, their wealth built on the kind of entrepreneurial ventures that thrived in Nevada's business-friendly environment. Robert's father had established himself as a successful businessman with interests spanning from real estate to early technology ventures, creating the foundation for what should have been a dynastic transfer of wealth and influence. The family name carried weight in Las Vegas circles, opening doors and creating opportunities that would have guaranteed young Robert a privileged path through life. But fate, as it so often does, had different plans for the House lineage. The tragedy that would define Robert's character and drive his future ambitions struck when he was barely old enough to form permanent memories, yet profound enough to shape every decision he would make thereafter. At the tender age of 2 years old, Robert Edwin House became an orphan through circumstances so bizarre and unlikely that they seemed scripted by some cosmic author, with a taste for ironic foreshadowing. The autogyro accident that claimed both of Robert's parents was the kind of freak occurrence that newspapers would later describe as a once-in-a-lifetime tragedy. The confluence of mechanical failure and meteorological disaster that defied rational prediction. His parents had been traveling in one of the early rotorcraft that represented the cutting edge of personal transportation technology, symbols of humanity's optimistic belief that engineering could conquer the limitations of geography and weather. The autogyro itself was a marvel of pre-war innovation, combining the vertical lifting capability of a helicopter with the forward flight efficiency of an airplane. The lightning strike that brought down their aircraft occurred during what should have been a routine flight, the kind of trip that thousands of Americans made weekly without incident or concern. Weather reports had indicated only minor atmospheric disturbances, the sort of conditions that experienced pilots navigated routinely with modern equipment and proper precautions. But the electromagnetic pulse generated by the lightning strike overwhelmed the autogyro's electrical systems, sending the aircraft plummeting toward the Nevada desert with no possibility of recovery or survival. Young Robert, left behind at home with caretakers during what was meant to be a brief business trip, would grow up knowing that his parents had died, pursuing the kind of technological convenience that he would later master and manipulate with unprecedented skill. The irony was not lost on him in later years, that the very innovation and risk-taking spirit that characterized the House family had also destroyed it, leaving him to rebuild their legacy from the ashes of their ambition. The loss of his parents at such a formative age created psychological patterns that would define Robert's approach to relationships, business, and survival throughout his extraordinary life. Trust became a calculated commodity rather than an emotional gift. Human connections were evaluated through cost-benefit analysis rather than developed through natural affection. Most significantly, the random nature of his parents' death instilled in Robert an obsession with controlling variables, with reducing uncertainty through superior planning and technological advantage. But the cruelest blow to young Robert's future was yet to come, delivered not by mechanical failure or natural disaster, but by the calculated greed of family members who should have protected his interests. Anthony House, Robert's half-brother from his father's previous marriage, had watched the family's growing wealth with the resentment that often festers in blended families where inheritance becomes a source of competition rather than security. Anthony had always considered himself the legitimate heir to the House family fortune, despite the legal reality that Robert's birth had fundamentally altered the succession plans that their father had established. In Anthony's mind, he represented continuity with the original House vision, while Robert was an accident of late-life romance that had unfairly disrupted the natural order of inheritance. These beliefs, festering through years of watching his half-brother receive the attention and opportunities that Anthony felt belonged to him, created the perfect conditions for betrayal when opportunity finally presented itself. The legal maneuvering that followed Robert's parents' death was conducted with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that made theft appear legitimate and abandonment seem reasonable. Anthony House possessed advantages that his infant half-brother could not counter: adult status, established relationships with family lawyers, and most importantly, immediate access to the financial instruments and legal documents that controlled the family's assets. While Robert remained in the care of hired guardians who were more concerned with their own employment security than their charge's financial interests, Anthony systematically diverted the House family wealth into his own accounts and investments. The mechanism of this theft was elegantly simple and devastatingly effective. Anthony argued to probate courts that as the older son and established business partner of his father, he represented the natural continuation of the House family enterprises. Robert, he claimed, was too young to inherit directly and would be better served by having his inheritance managed by someone with proven business experience and family connections. The courts, faced with the choice between awarding control to a successful businessman or placing assets in trust for an infant, made the decision that seemed most reasonable to adults who had never experienced the betrayal of family greed. Within months of his parents' death, Robert Edwin House had been transformed from one of the wealthiest heirs in Nevada to a ward of the state, dependent on the generosity of relatives who viewed his continued existence as an expensive inconvenience. Anthony House took control of the family business, the real estate holdings, the investment portfolio, and most crucially, the technological patents and research projects that would have formed the foundation of Robert's future empire. The H&H Tools Company, which should have been Robert's inheritance, became Anthony's personal kingdom. The psychological impact of this betrayal was profound and lasting, creating in young Robert a worldview that would shape his approach to business, relationships, and power for the next 2.5 centuries. Trust became synonymous with vulnerability. Family became a source of potential threat rather than security. Legal systems revealed themselves as mechanisms that protected the powerful rather than the righteous. Most importantly, Robert learned that survival in a hostile world required not just intelligence or determination, but the kind of overwhelming advantage that made opposition impossible rather than merely inadvisable. The foster care system that claimed Robert after Anthony's legal victory was adequate but loveless, providing the basic necessities for physical development, while offering little emotional nurturing or intellectual stimulation. His guardians were well-meaning but overworked, managing multiple children with limited resources and less personal investment in any individual child's future success. They ensured that Robert attended school, received proper medical care, and developed basic social skills, but they could not provide the kind of privileged education and business mentorship that his birth circumstances should have guaranteed. Despite these limitations, Robert's intellectual gifts began manifesting early, creating ripples of recognition among teachers and administrators who had rarely encountered such precocious talent in their institutional settings. He displayed an intuitive grasp of mathematical concepts that exceeded his age-appropriate curriculum by several grade levels. His reading comprehension advanced at a pace that required constant curriculum adjustments. Most remarkably, he showed an early fascination with technology and engineering that suggested not just intellectual curiosity, but genuine, innovative potential. The young Robert House, who emerged from these formative experiences, was brilliant, driven, and fundamentally alone in ways that created both tremendous opportunity and profound vulnerability. His intellectual gifts provided the tools necessary for extraordinary achievement, while his emotional isolation created the psychological distance required for ruthless decision-making. The betrayal he had experienced taught him that power must be absolute to be secure, that trust was a luxury he could not afford, and that the world respected only strength backed by superior resources and planning. These early experiences also instilled in Robert an obsession with contingency planning and risk management that would characterize his entire approach to business and survival. Having witnessed how quickly wealth and security could disappear through the actions of those closest to him, he developed a compulsive need to identify and prepare for every possible threat to his interests. This psychological tendency would eventually evolve into the mathematical paradigms and probability calculations that enabled him to predict the Great War itself. As Robert approached his 18th birthday and the age of legal independence, he had transformed from a privileged heir into something far more dangerous, a brilliant young man with nothing to lose and everything to prove. The fortune that should have been his inheritance would have to be rebuilt from nothing. The family connections that should have opened doors had been severed by Anthony's betrayal. The comfortable future that his birth should have guaranteed had been replaced by the necessity of creating his own opportunities through superior intelligence and unshakable determination. But perhaps most significantly, Robert House had learned the fundamental lesson that would guide him through centuries of challenge and triumph. That in a world where randomness could destroy everything in an instant, only those who could predict, prepare for, and control the variables of existence could hope to survive and prosper. The orphaned child would grow into a man who refused to leave anything to chance, who calculated probabilities with obsessive precision, and who built redundancies into every plan to ensure that betrayal, accident, or enemy action could never again strip him of what he had worked to achieve. The stage was now set for one of history's most remarkable educational journeys. As Robert House prepared to enter the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, with the kind of focused ambition that emerges only from those who have lost everything and refuse to accept that loss as permanent. The boy who had been robbed of his inheritance would become the man who robbed the nuclear apocalypse of its ultimate victory. But first he would need to acquire the knowledge and skills that would transform raw intelligence into world-changing power. The Commonwealth Institute of Technology in 2042 represented everything that the pre-war world believed about progress, innovation, and the unlimited potential of human intelligence applied to technological challenges. Its sprawling campus in Massachusetts had become a pilgrimage destination for the brightest minds of a generation that still believed engineering could solve any problem, and that the future held nothing but expanding prosperity and possibility. For Robert Edwin House, Arriving at age 22 with nothing but his exceptional intellect and burning determination to reclaim what had been stolen from him, the Institute represented both opportunity and weapon in his war against a world that had betrayed him. House's acceptance into the Institute's advanced programs was itself a testament to his remarkable abilities, achieved despite the absence of family connections or financial resources that smoothed the path for most of his peers. His application essays had demonstrated not just mastery of complex mathematical and engineering concepts, but an intuitive understanding of how technology could be leveraged to create unprecedented forms of power and influence. The admissions committee, accustomed to evaluating brilliant students, recognized in House something rarer, a mind that combined theoretical sophistication with practical ambition in ways that suggested genuine revolutionary potential. The curriculum that House devoured during his years at the Institute spanned the cutting edge of multiple disciplines, from advanced robotics and artificial intelligence to complex systems analysis and predictive modeling. But perhaps more importantly, he absorbed the business and management theories that would enable him to transform technological innovation into economic dominance. House understood that brilliance without capital was merely academic exercise, while capital without innovation was vulnerable to obsolescence. His goal was to master both domains so completely that his future enterprises would be invulnerable to the kind of betrayal that had destroyed his childhood security. House's professors quickly recognized that they were dealing with a student whose capabilities exceeded normal academic frameworks. His assignments consistently demonstrated not just comprehension of assigned material, but extensions and applications that revealed thinking several steps ahead of his instructor's expectations. He would submit robotics designs that solved problems the faculty had not yet realized existed. His software architectures displayed elegance and efficiency that suggested almost supernatural intuition for how complex systems could be optimized. Most remarkably, his business case studies revealed an understanding of market dynamics and competitive strategy that seemed to emerge from decades of practical experience rather than classroom theory. The relationships that House formed during his institute years were carefully calculated rather than emotionally driven, chosen for their potential to advance his long-term objectives rather than provide companionship or social satisfaction. He cultivated connections with faculty members whose research aligned with his interests, offering assistance with their projects in exchange for access to advanced resources and insider knowledge about emerging technologies. He formed study partnerships with fellow students whose family connections or financial resources might prove useful in future ventures, though he remained emotionally distant even from those he worked with most closely. The intellectual environment of the Institute also provided House with his first opportunities to test his theories about predictive analysis and systematic risk assessment. He began developing mathematical models that attempted to forecast technological trends, market movements, and even political developments with unprecedented accuracy. These early experiments in applied probability would eventually evolve into the sophisticated analytical frameworks that enabled him to predict the Great War itself. But during his student years, they served primarily to guide his investment strategies and business planning. House's thesis project, completed during his final year at the Institute, demonstrated the synthesis of technological innovation and business strategy that would characterize his entire career. He designed and built a prototype robotic system that could perform complex manufacturing tasks with precision and reliability that exceeded human capabilities, while simultaneously developing the business plan for mass production and market penetration that would make such robots commercially viable. The project was ambitious beyond what most students attempted, but House executed it with the kind of methodical precision that made success appear inevitable rather than merely possible. Upon graduating from the institute in 2042, House possessed not just advanced technical knowledge, but a comprehensive understanding of how innovation could be weaponized in the service of wealth accumulation and power concentration. He had studied the rise and fall of previous technology companies, analyzing the strategic mistakes that had allowed promising ventures to be destroyed by competitors or regulatory interference. Most importantly, he had developed the philosophical framework that would guide his approach to business. That market dominance required not just superior products, but systematic elimination of potential threats through whatever means proved necessary. The founding of RobCo Industries represented House's declaration of war against a world that had stolen his birthright and abandoned him to institutional care. At 22 years old, with no family wealth or established connections to ease his path, House set out to build an empire that would be so powerful, so technologically advanced, and so strategically positioned that no force on Earth could threaten its continued existence. The company name itself was both personal branding and psychological armor. Robert House would become RobCo, and RobCo would become synonymous with technological supremacy. The initial capital for RobCo came from House's carefully managed savings and a series of small loans that he had secured through his academic achievements and business plan presentations. He had spent his final year at the institute not just completing his studies but also conducting market research, identifying potential investors, and developing the product roadmap that would guide RobCo's early development. His approach was methodical and comprehensive, leaving nothing to chance or optimism, in ways that reflected his fundamental mistrust of any plan that depended on good fortune or the goodwill of others. RobCo's first products were sophisticated but narrowly focused, designed to establish the company's reputation for technical excellence, while generating the revenue streams necessary for expansion into more ambitious projects. House had identified gaps in the existing robotics market, where superior engineering could command premium prices, particularly in industrial automation systems where reliability and precision translated directly into cost savings for corporate customers. These early successes provided both financial foundation and market credibility that enabled RobCo to attract the kind of top-tier engineering talent that House required for his longer-term objectives. The corporate culture that House established at RobCo reflected his personal experiences with betrayal and his determination to prevent internal threats from undermining his growing empire. Employee contracts included comprehensive non-disclosure agreements and non-compete clauses that made defection to rival companies economically devastating. Compensation packages were structured to reward loyalty and long-term commitment, while punishing short-term thinking or external temptations. Most importantly, House retained personal control over all critical decisions and strategic direction, ensuring that no board of directors or investor group could replicate Anthony's betrayal on a corporate scale. RobCo's breakthrough innovations began appearing within the company's first 5 years of operation, establishing House as one of the most visionary entrepreneurs of his generation while simultaneously generating the massive profits that would fuel his expansion into adjacent markets. The company's robotic systems achieved levels of sophistication and reliability that competitors struggled to match, incorporating artificial intelligence algorithms and adaptive learning capabilities that seem to anticipate user needs rather than merely responding to programmed instructions. More importantly, these products created customer dependencies that made switching to rival systems prohibitively expensive and technically complex. The software architectures that accompanied RobCo's hardware products demonstrated House's understanding that long-term competitive advantage lay not just in superior engineering, but in the creation of technological ecosystems that rewarded continued loyalty while punishing defection. RobCo systems worked best when integrated with other RobCo products, creating natural incentives for customers to expand their purchases rather than seeking alternatives. The software required regular updates and maintenance that only RobCo could provide, generating recurring revenue streams that funded continued research and development, while making competitor entry into established markets virtually impossible. House's business strategy during RobCo's early expansion phase combined aggressive innovation with ruthless competitive tactics that eliminated potential threats before they could achieve market foothold. The company's research and development budget exceeded industry standards by enormous margins, enabling RobCo to maintain technological leadership through continuous advancement rather than relying on temporary advantages that competitors might eventually match. Simultaneously, House employed patent litigation, predatory pricing, and strategic acquisition offers to neutralize promising startups before they could challenge RobCo's market position. The wealth that RobCo generated during these formative years exceeded even House's ambitious projections, creating financial resources that enabled expansion into entirely new markets and business sectors. By his 30th birthday, House claimed that his company had achieved net worth exceeding $30 billion, though the private nature of RobCo's ownership made independent verification impossible. Whether the exact figure was accurate or aspirational, the company's visible success and market dominance demonstrated wealth accumulation at a pace that placed House among the richest individuals in America, if not the world. The investment opportunities that such enormous wealth created allowed House to extend his influence far beyond robotics and software into sectors that would prove crucial for his future survival and power accumulation. He acquired substantial positions in RepCon Aerospace, recognizing that space technology and rocket systems might prove essential for long-term human survival in an increasingly unstable world. His investment in the Lucky 38 Hotel and Casino established his presence in Las Vegas while providing both revenue streams and the local connections that would prove vital when the world ended, and he needed to rebuild civilization from his Nevada stronghold. Perhaps most strategically, House began positioning himself to acquire H&H Tools Company, the business that his half-brother Anthony had stolen through legal manipulation decades earlier. RobCo's financial resources and market position now enabled House to orchestrate a hostile takeover that would simultaneously reclaim his birthright and demonstrate to the world that betrayal carried consequences that could span decades before reaching their inevitable conclusion. The campaign against H&H Tools was conducted with surgical precision, combining stock manipulation, customer poaching, and regulatory pressure to systematically destroy the company's market position, while creating conditions that would force Anthony to accept RobCo's acquisition offer. The psychological satisfaction that House derived from reclaiming H&H Tools was complicated by the recognition that revenge, however perfectly executed, could not restore the relationships and opportunities that Anthony's betrayal had destroyed. The wealth and power that House had accumulated through his own efforts exceeded anything he might have inherited through family connections, but the decades spent building RobCo had also isolated him from normal human relationships and emotional connections. Success had required him to become someone who trusted no one completely and viewed every relationship through the lens of potential advantage or threat. House's personal life during these years reflected the same careful calculation and emotional distance that characterized his business operations. His romantic relationships, when they existed at all, were brief and superficial, chosen more for social utility or public image than genuine affection. His living arrangements emphasized security and privacy over comfort or hospitality, reflecting his fundamental belief that vulnerability in any form invited exploitation. Even his recreational activities were selected for their potential to provide business, intelligence, or useful connections, rather than simple enjoyment. The media attention that accompanied House's rise to prominence portrayed him as a brilliant but eccentric figure whose unconventional methods and mysterious personal life generated both admiration and suspicion among observers who struggled to understand his motivations and objectives. Tabloid articles speculated about his unusual relationships with Hollywood starlets, describing encounters that seemed to focus more on psychological analysis than romantic involvement. These stories, whether accurate or fabricated, contributed to House's growing reputation as someone whose intelligence exceeded normal human parameters, while operating according to principles that ordinary people could not comprehend or predict. The foreign press coverage of House's activities was particularly intrigued by reports of his relationship with an unnamed actress, described in lurid detail that emphasized the unconventional nature of their interactions. According to these accounts, House's interest in the woman centered not on physical intimacy, but on detailed psychological study, with elaborate sessions involving costume changes and behavioral analysis that suggested research rather than romance. Whether these reports reflected actual events or journalist imagination, they contributed to House's mystique, while reinforcing perceptions that his approach to human relationships was fundamentally different from normal social patterns. The mathematical paradigms that House developed during his leisure hours represented perhaps the most significant intellectual achievement of his early career, though their importance would not become apparent until decades later when they successfully predicted the end of the world. These complex analytical frameworks attempted to model global political and economic systems with sufficient accuracy to forecast major developments years or decades in advance. The project combined House's engineering expertise with advanced economic theory and political science, creating predictive tools that exceeded anything previously attempted by academic or government researchers. The initial results of House's forecasting experiments were promising enough to encourage continued refinement and expansion of his analytical models. He successfully predicted several minor market fluctuations and political developments, generating profits that funded continued research while building confidence in his methodological approach. More importantly, the mathematical frameworks revealed patterns and trends in global affairs that suggested increasing instability and the growing likelihood of catastrophic conflict between major powers. These early warnings would eventually culminate in his prediction of the Great War itself. But during the company's growth phase, they served primarily to guide RobCo's strategic planning and investment decisions. House's corporate empire by the mid-2060s represented unprecedented integration of technological innovation, market dominance, and strategic positioning that placed him among the most influential individuals in pre-war America. RobCo's products were essential components of infrastructure systems throughout the country, creating dependencies that made the company too important to fail, while generating revenue streams that funded continued expansion and research. His investments in aerospace, entertainment, and defense sectors provided both diversification and intelligence about developments that might affect his long-term survival and continued prosperity. The success that House had achieved through 2 decades of relentless effort and strategic brilliance was both vindication of his capabilities and preparation for challenges that would test those capabilities beyond anything he had yet encountered. The orphan child who had been robbed of his inheritance had become one of the wealthiest and most powerful individuals in the world. But the same analytical frameworks that had enabled his rise were beginning to reveal threats that wealth and conventional power would be inadequate to address. The Great War was approaching with mathematical certainty, And even Robert House's vast empire would require radical transformation to survive humanity's final conflict with itself. The mathematical paradigms that Robert House developed during the prosperous years of the 2060s began as intellectual exercises, elaborate games played by a mind that found conventional business challenges insufficient to fully engage its analytical capabilities. What started as abstract modeling of global political and economic systems gradually evolved into something far more ominous, a comprehensive framework for predicting the trajectory of human civilization itself. House's equations were painting a picture of the future that contradicted every assumption about progress and stability that defined the pre-war era's optimistic worldview. The initial variables that House fed into his predictive models were drawn from publicly available economic data, demographic trends, and geopolitical developments that any sophisticated analyst might consider relevant to long-term forecasting. Resource depletion rates, population growth patterns, military spending increases, and technological advancement curves all contributed to mathematical relationships that revealed hidden connections between seemingly unrelated global phenomena. What emerged from these calculations was a pattern of escalating tensions and diminishing options that suggested humanity was approaching a critical decision point about its own survival. The sophistication of House's analytical frameworks exceeded anything previously attempted by academic institutions or government intelligence agencies, combining advanced computer modeling with economic theory and game theory applications that treated entire nations as players in an increasingly zero-sum competition for finite resources. His algorithms incorporated feedback loops and cascade effects that captured the complex interdependencies of modern civilization, revealing how localized conflicts could trigger regional instabilities that might eventually spiral into global catastrophe through mechanisms too subtle for conventional analysis to detect. The first concrete prediction that emerged from House's mathematical modeling concerned the timeline for resource wars that would inevitably emerge as competition for oil, water, and arable land intensified beyond the capacity of diplomatic solutions to manage. His calculations suggested that by the late 2070s, scarcity would reach critical thresholds that would make armed conflict between major powers mathematically inevitable rather than merely probable. The precision of this prediction was disturbing enough, but the implications that flowed from resource competition were even more troubling for anyone who understood the destructive potential of advanced military technology. House's analysis of nuclear weapons proliferation and delivery system capabilities painted an increasingly grim picture of how resource conflicts might escalate beyond conventional warfare into exchanges of mass destruction that could effectively end human civilization. His models incorporated the psychology of desperate leadership, the dynamics of alliance structures under extreme stress, and the strategic calculations that might make nuclear first strikes appear rational to decision-makers facing existential threats to their nation's survival. The mathematics were inexorable. Given sufficient pressure and limited alternatives, someone would eventually cross the threshold from conventional to nuclear warfare. The convergence of multiple trend lines in House's predictive models pointed toward a specific time frame that sent chills through his calculating mind, despite his emotional detachment from most human concerns. By 2065, his equations were consistently indicating that global nuclear war would occur sometime between 2075 and 2085, with the most probable scenarios clustering around the year 2080. The precision of this prediction was both testament to the sophistication of his analytical methods and terrifying confirmation that the world was approaching a mathematically predictable apocalypse. The psychological impact of these calculations on House himself was profound and transformative, forcing him to confront the reality that all his wealth, power, and technological superiority would be meaningless if human civilization destroyed itself within the next 15 years. The empire he had built through decades of brilliant strategy and ruthless execution would vanish in nuclear fire, along with everything else humanity had achieved. Unless, of course, he could find ways to protect his investments and perhaps himself from the coming catastrophe that his own mathematical models had revealed with disturbing clarity. The secret meeting that would crystallize House's understanding of the approaching apocalypse occurred in late 2065, when he received an invitation to gather with other corporate leaders, whose combined wealth and influence represented a significant percentage of America's total economic output. The invitation itself was carefully worded to suggest discussion of mutual business interests rather than conspiracy, but House's analytical mind immediately recognized that such a gathering could only have one purpose: coordination of responses to threats that exceeded any individual corporation's ability to address independently. The attendees at this clandestine conference represented the apex of American corporate power, each controlling industries that were essential to the nation's economic and technological infrastructure. Bob Howard and Bob Asins of Vault Tech brought expertise in underground construction and population management systems. Frederick Sinclair of the Sierra Madre contributed knowledge of advanced security technologies and automated defense systems. Julia Masters of RepCon Aerospace offered insights into space-based survival options and missile defense capabilities. Leon von Felden of WestTech provided military applications and weapons development perspectives that would prove crucial for understanding the coming conflict's likely characteristics. The discussion that unfolded during this secret gathering confirmed House's worst fears, while revealing that other brilliant minds had reached similar conclusions through independent analysis of global trends and strategic developments. The corporate leaders assembled around that conference table possessed intelligence resources that rivaled government agencies, and their collective assessment of humanity's prospects was uniformly pessimistic. Nuclear war was not merely possible but inevitable, probably within the next 10 to 15 years, and the scale of destruction would exceed anything in human history. Howard's presentation of Vault-Tech's contingency planning revealed the most chilling aspect of the corporate elite's response to the approaching apocalypse. They were not planning to prevent the nuclear war, but to profit from it. The Vault system that Vault-Tech had developed under government contracts was designed not primarily for public safety, but for social experimentation, using isolated populations as test subjects for behavioral modification techniques and population control methods that might prove useful in post-war reconstruction efforts. The nuclear apocalypse was being treated not as tragedy to prevent, but as opportunity to exploit. House's objections to the Vault system's fundamental assumptions reflected both his analytical rigor and his recognition that underground communities would face psychological and logistical challenges that might prove insurmountable over the extended periods required for surface conditions to become habitable again. Confined populations subjected to artificial environments and authoritarian control structures would likely experience mental breakdowns, violent conflicts, and social collapse that would make them less capable of rebuilding civilization than surface survivors who maintained greater autonomy and adaptability despite facing higher radiation exposure and resource scarcity. The philosophical differences that emerged during these discussions revealed the varied approaches that America's elite were taking towards survival in the post-nuclear world, each reflecting different assessments of what would be required to preserve human civilization through its greatest crisis. Vault-Tech's faith in controlled environments and social engineering represented one extreme, while House's preference for technological superiority and strategic positioning offered an alternative that emphasized individual capability over collective management. These competing visions would eventually shape the post-war world's political landscape as surviving factions implemented their preferred approaches to reconstruction and governance. The intelligence that House gathered from his corporate peers confirmed his mathematical models while providing crucial details about the likely timing and characteristics of the coming nuclear exchange. Government planning documents that had been shared through unofficial channels suggested that military leaders were already developing first strike capabilities and target lists that would ensure maximum damage to enemy infrastructure and population centers. The window for diplomatic solutions was closing rapidly as both American and Chinese leadership concluded that preemptive action offered better survival prospects than defensive preparations. House's departure from the secret meeting marked the beginning of his most ambitious project, the development of comprehensive survival systems that would enable him to preserve not just his own life but his technological capabilities and strategic position through the nuclear apocalypse and into the post-war period. The scale of this undertaking exceeded anything he had previously attempted, requiring innovations in life support technology, defensive systems, and automated management that would push even his engineering expertise to its absolute limits. The life support system that House designed for his personal survival represented a radical fusion of medical technology and computer integration that would preserve his consciousness and decision-making capabilities while maintaining his physical body in a state of suspended animation that could theoretically continue indefinitely. The technical challenges involved in creating such a system were enormous, requiring breakthroughs in neural interface technology, biological preservation techniques, and automated medical monitoring that were at the very edge of pre-war scientific capability. The integration of House's consciousness with his computer network represented perhaps the most ambitious aspect of his survival planning, creating a hybrid entity that would combine human intelligence and intuition with computational power and data processing capabilities that far exceeded either component operating independently. This technological fusion would enable House to maintain awareness of developing situations while accessing analytical tools that could process vast amounts of information and identify patterns that purely human consciousness might miss. The defensive systems that House developed to protect Las Vegas from nuclear attack required innovations in missile interception technology, electromagnetic pulse generation, and target acquisition that represented significant advances over existing military systems. The laser defense network mounted on the Lucky 38 casino would serve as the final line of protection against warheads that penetrated his primary defensive perimeter, while underground installations would provide backup power and control systems that could continue operating even if surface facilities suffered damage from near-miss explosions. The platinum chip that would control these defensive systems represented House's attempt to create a single point of coordination for all the technological innovations he was developing to ensure Las Vegas's survival through the nuclear apocalypse. This small device would contain the operating system upgrades and coordination protocols that would enable his defensive systems to function at optimal efficiency, providing the split-second timing and precision targeting that would be essential for intercepting multiple incoming warheads while managing power distribution and system redundancy throughout the engagement. The manufacturing and testing of the platinum chip required House to establish secure facilities and recruit personnel with the highest possible security clearances, as the device's capabilities represented military technology that could potentially alter the strategic balance if it fell into enemy hands. The chip's completion in late 2077 would mark the culmination of more than a decade of intensive research and development, creating the technological key that would unlock House's complete defensive capability just in time for the nuclear war that his mathematical models predicted was now imminent. The final preparations that House made during the weeks before the Great War reflected his understanding that even the most sophisticated planning could be undermined by unpredictable timing and logistical complications that might prevent critical systems from being activated when they were most needed. Backup plans, redundant systems, and alternative activation procedures were implemented to ensure that temporary delays or equipment failures would not compromise the overall defensive strategy that represented his only hope for surviving humanity's final conflict with itself. The psychological transformation that House underwent during these years of preparation was as significant as the technological innovations he developed. As the man who had once sought wealth and influence for their own sake gradually evolved into someone whose primary motivation was preserving human potential through civilization's darkest period. The mathematical certainty of approaching catastrophe had stripped away conventional ambitions and social considerations, leaving only the essential question of what forms of knowledge, capability, and leadership would be required to rebuild the world after nuclear fire had swept away the old order. House's final review of his defensive preparations in early 2077 revealed a comprehensive system that should theoretically be capable of protecting Las Vegas from even concentrated nuclear attack, provided that all components functioned as designed, and the platinum chip arrived in time to activate the coordination protocols that would enable optimal system performance. The margin for error was slim, but House's mathematical analysis suggested better than 50% probability of successful defense, odds that seemed reasonable given the absolute certainty of destruction that awaited those who made no preparations at all. The countdown to Armageddon that House's models had predicted was now measured in months rather than years, creating urgency that pervaded every aspect of his final preparations, while simultaneously validating the analytical frameworks that had consumed more than a decade of his intellectual energy. The world was indeed approaching the mathematical precipice that his equations had identified, and whether his technological solutions would prove adequate to preserve even a small portion of human civilization through the coming catastrophe remained to be seen. The ultimate test of Robert House's genius was approaching with the inevitability of nuclear physics itself. The morning of October 22nd, 2077, dawned with deceptive tranquility across the American Southwest, carrying no hint of the catastrophe that would unfold within 24 hours and transform human civilization forever. Robert House stood in his penthouse office atop the Lucky 38 casino, reviewing final preparations for defensive systems that represented more than a decade of intensive research, development, and strategic planning. His mathematical models had predicted this moment with disturbing accuracy, but the reality of approaching Armageddon carried emotional weight that even his analytical mind found difficult to process with complete detachment. The platinum chip that would serve as the crucial coordination mechanism for Las Vegas's defense network was completing its final manufacturing processes in the Sunnyvale facility, where House's most trusted technicians were conducting last-minute quality assurance testing on the device that represented his city's only hope for surviving the nuclear exchange that was now mathematically inevitable. The chip's sophisticated programming contained operating system upgrades for his Securitron army and laser defense grid that would enable response times measured in milliseconds rather than seconds, the kind of precision that would determine whether incoming warheads were intercepted or reached their targets. The delivery schedule that House had established for the platinum chip represented careful coordination between multiple security contractors and transportation specialists, designed to ensure that the device reached Las Vegas with sufficient time for installation and system testing before the nuclear war that his calculations indicated would begin within the next 48 hours. Every aspect of the delivery timeline had been planned with obsessive attention to detail, incorporating redundant routes, backup personnel, and contingency procedures that should theoretically prevent any foreseeable delay or complication from compromising the mission's success. The miscalculation that would prove nearly catastrophic for House's entire survival strategy was subtle but devastating. A mathematical error of merely 20 hours that reflected the inherent limitations of even the most sophisticated predictive modeling when applied to complex systems, involving human decision-making and geopolitical variables beyond any individual's control. House's algorithms had consistently indicated that the nuclear exchange would begin on October 24th, providing adequate time for the platinum chip's afternoon delivery on October 23rd and subsequent system activation before hostile missiles began targeting American cities. The reality of global politics and military planning proved slightly more volatile than even House's comprehensive models had anticipated, with Chinese leadership making strategic decisions approximately 1 day earlier than his calculations had predicted, triggering the nuclear exchange that would devastate human civilization, while the platinum chip remained in transit rather than safely installed in Las Vegas's defensive systems. The irony was not lost on House that his survival depended on technological precision, yet would be threatened by the same kind of timing miscalculation that had cost him his inheritance decades earlier. The Great War began not with dramatic announcements or formal declarations, but with the quiet activation of launch sequences in missile silos scattered across 2 continents, as military commanders on both sides concluded that preemptive strikes offered better survival prospects than defensive preparations or diplomatic solutions. The first warheads to leave their underground chambers carried the concentrated fury of atoms split and fused in service of strategic objectives that would become meaningless within hours, as civilization's greatest achievement became the instrument of its own destruction through the simple expedient of pressing buttons and turning keys. House's monitoring systems detected the initial missile launches through satellite feeds and intelligence networks that he had established to provide early warning of exactly this scenario. But the information arrived with the cold precision of mathematical confirmation rather than the shock of unexpected catastrophe. His predictions had been accurate to within 24 hours, a level of forecasting precision that would have been remarkable under any other circumstances, but felt like failure when those 24 hours represented the difference between successful defense and potential annihilation. The defensive systems that House had spent more than a decade developing and refining were forced to operate without the coordination and optimization that the platinum chip would have provided, relying on backup programming and manual override capabilities that represented significant compromises in response time, target acquisition accuracy, and power management efficiency. The laser defense network remained functional, but would be operating at perhaps 70% of its designed capability, while the Securitron army would lack the advanced tactical coordination that might prove essential for managing multiple simultaneous threats. The 77 nuclear warheads that converged on Las Vegas and its surrounding areas represented one of the most concentrated attacks in the entire nuclear exchange, reflecting the city's strategic importance as a major population center and the military significance of Nellis Air Force Base and other installations that made the region a high-priority target for enemy planners. The missiles approached from multiple vectors and altitudes, designed to overwhelm defensive systems through sheer numbers and tactical complexity that would challenge even the most sophisticated interception capabilities. House's mathematical analysis of the incoming attack unfolded in real time as his monitoring systems tracked individual warheads and calculated interception probabilities for each potential target, creating a complex three-dimensional chess game played at hypersonic speeds with the survival of Las Vegas hanging in the balance. The defensive systems responded with mechanical precision, laser batteries swiveling to acquire targets, while electromagnetic pulse generators prepared to disable warhead guidance systems through coordinated electronic warfare that represented the cutting edge of pre-war military technology. The first phase of the defensive engagement proved remarkably successful, with House's networked mainframes successfully penetrating the guidance systems of 59 incoming warheads and transmitting disarm codes that neutralized the nuclear weapons while they remained at high altitude, transforming instruments of mass destruction into harmless debris that would scatter across the Nevada desert without exploding. The electromagnetic warfare capabilities that House had developed exceeded even his own optimistic projections, demonstrating the kind of technological superiority that justified years of intensive research and development. The 9 warheads that survived the electronic countermeasures and continued their descent toward Las Vegas presented the ultimate test of House's laser defense network, requiring precision targeting and power management that pushed the system to its absolute operational limits, while operating without the coordination protocols that the platinum chip would have provided. The laser batteries engaged their targets with concentrated energy beams that heated incoming warheads to temperatures that caused structural failure and nuclear payload dispersal, creating spectacular fireworks. Displays as multi-megaton weapons were reduced to superheated metallic fragments. The laser defense network's performance during those crucial minutes exceeded House's most optimistic calculations, successfully destroying 9 additional warheads through direct energy engagement that demonstrated remarkable accuracy and power output, despite operating on backup programming rather than the optimized systems that the platinum chip would have enabled. The combination of electronic warfare and directed energy weapons had neutralized 68 of the 77 incoming warheads, achieving a defensive success rate that no other location on Earth would match during the nuclear exchange. The 9 warheads that penetrated House's defensive perimeter and reached ground level represented both failure and success, as none of them struck Las Vegas directly, despite carrying sufficient destructive power to obliterate the city and everyone within it. The impacts occurred in surrounding areas where they created massive craters and radioactive contamination, but left the urban core relatively intact, though the electromagnetic pulses and thermal effects from the near-miss explosions would cause significant damage to unprotected electronic systems throughout the region. The moment of defensive success was immediately followed by systemic failure as the electromagnetic pulses from nearby nuclear detonations wreaked havoc on House's computer networks and life support systems, creating cascading failures that his backup programming was not sophisticated enough to manage without the coordination capabilities that the platinum chip would have provided. The same defensive systems that had saved Las Vegas from direct nuclear attack were now compromised by the after effects of their own success, leaving House vulnerable to the kind of technological breakdown that he had spent years trying to prevent. The life support system that was designed to preserve House's physical body while maintaining his consciousness through computer interface began experiencing critical malfunctions as electromagnetic interference disrupted the delicate balance of medical monitoring and automated adjustment, systems that were essential for his survival in the hybrid biological technological state he had created for himself. The neural connections that linked his brain to his computer network became unreliable, creating communication gaps and processing delays that threatened to sever his consciousness from the technological framework that sustained it. House's last coherent thoughts before the system failures forced him into emergency shutdown mode, were focused not on his personal survival, but on the incomplete nature of his defensive success and the implications for Las Vegas's long-term viability in the post-nuclear world that was now beginning to emerge from the ashes of the old civilization. He had saved the city from direct destruction but had failed to maintain the technological superiority that would be essential for protecting it from the human scavengers and hostile forces that would inevitably emerge as central authority collapsed and desperate survivors competed for scarce resources. The emergency protocols that activated as House's consciousness faded into artificial coma were designed to preserve his biological functions at minimum sustainable levels while protecting his neural pathways from degradation that might prove irreversible if the unconscious period extended beyond the few days or weeks that his original planning had anticipated. The system was sophisticated enough to maintain basic life support, but lacked the advanced monitoring and adjustment capabilities that would be necessary for extended periods of unconsciousness, measured in years or decades rather than days. The irony of House's situation as the Great War concluded and nuclear winter settled over the devastated landscape was both profound and tragic. He had achieved the greatest defensive success of the entire nuclear exchange while simultaneously suffering system failures that would prevent him from capitalizing on that success for decades to come. Las Vegas remained largely intact when most other major cities had been reduced to radioactive ruins, but its protector was trapped in technological limbo that rendered his survival meaningless until the systems that sustained him could be repaired or replaced. The platinum chip that would have prevented these system failures and enabled House to maintain consciousness through the immediate post-war period lay buried in the ruins of Sunnyvale, its sophisticated programming intact but inaccessible to the man who needed it most. The device represented both salvation and curse, close enough to Las Vegas to be theoretically recoverable, but far enough away to remain beyond reach, while House remained unconscious, and his Securitron army operated on primitive, backup programming that was inadequate for the complex search and recovery operations that would be required. The silence that settled over the Lucky 38 casino as House's consciousness faded into artificial sleep was matched by the broader quiet that descended on a world where electromagnetic pulses had disabled most electronic communications and transportation systems, leaving survivors isolated in pockets of devastation, while radioactive fallout began its deadly drift across continents that would remain contaminated for generations. The nuclear exchange that House had predicted with such mathematical precision had indeed occurred almost exactly as his models had forecasted, but the aftermath would prove far more complex and challenging than even his comprehensive analysis had anticipated. The defensive systems that had saved Las Vegas continued operating on automatic routines that gradually degraded without human oversight or maintenance, their sophisticated programming slowly corrupting as radiation exposure and power fluctuations took their toll on computer systems that were designed for short-term emergency operation rather than extended autonomous function. The city that House had protected at such enormous cost began its slow decline into the wasteland conditions that characterized most of the post-war world, though it remained more habitable than the radioactive craters that marked former population centers throughout America and China. The Great War's conclusion marked not victory or defeat, but transformation, the end of the old world and the beginning of something entirely different that would emerge from the ruins of nuclear devastation. Robert House had achieved his primary objective of preserving Las Vegas from direct destruction, but the cost of that success had been his own conscious participation in the post-war world that his mathematical models had predicted but could not fully describe. The man who had calculated the end of civilization would sleep through its aftermath, dreaming Whatever dreams might visit, a mind suspended between life and death, while the world above slowly began the long process of deciding what form human society might take in the shadow of atomic fire. The stage was now set for the longest chapter in House's extraordinary life, not the decades of preparation or moments of crisis that had defined his pre-war existence, but the centuries of unconscious waiting that would test the durability of his technological solutions and the persistence of his vision for humanity's future in ways that no amount of planning or calculation could have anticipated. The darkness that enveloped Robert House's consciousness on October 23, 2077, was not the simple absence of awareness that characterizes normal sleep, but something far more complex and technologically mediated. A state of suspended animation, where his mind drifted through digital landscapes, while his body remained preserved in a cocoon of life support machinery that hummed with mechanical persistence in the depths of the Lucky 38 casino. The emergency protocols that had activated as his primary systems failed were designed for temporary preservation, creating a technological limbo that would stretch far beyond their original parameters as the post-war world evolved around his motionless form. The dreams that visited House during these decades of unconsciousness were fragments of memory and calculation, mathematical equations that solved themselves in endless loops while images of nuclear fire played against the backdrop of his sleeping mind. His consciousness, partially disconnected from the computer networks that had augmented his cognitive capabilities, processed information at a reduced rate that created strange temporal distortions where minutes felt like hours and years compressed into fleeting moments of mathematical clarity that dissolved before they could be fully grasped or understood. The life support systems that sustained House through the early post-war period operated with the kind of mechanical reliability that justified his faith in technological solutions, though they were forced to manage challenges that exceeded their original design parameters, as radiation exposure, power fluctuations, and equipment degradation created cascading problems that required constant automatic adjustment and resource reallocation. The nuclear-hardened power sources that fed his equipment proved adequate for extended operation, but the delicate balance of medical monitoring and biological support required more sophisticated oversight than the backup programming could provide without human intervention. The slow deterioration of House's computer networks during these years of unconsciousness created gaps in his technological capabilities that would prove devastating when he finally awakened, as radiation damage and power surges gradually corrupted data storage systems and processing capabilities that represented decades of accumulated knowledge and strategic planning. The quantum computers that had enabled his predictive modeling began experiencing memory failures and calculation errors that would compromise his ability to analyze complex situations with the precision that had characterized his pre-war decision-making. The world above House's underground sanctuary transformed in ways that his mathematical models had anticipated in broad outline but could not predict in specific detail. As survivors emerged from shelters and began the long process of rebuilding human civilization from the scattered remnants of the old world's infrastructure and knowledge, Las Vegas, protected by House's defensive systems from direct nuclear attack, remained more habitable than most urban areas, but the absence of central authority and the breakdown of supply chains created conditions that favored scavengers and raiders over legitimate reconstruction efforts. The Securitron army that House had created to protect Las Vegas operated on increasingly degraded programming as years passed without maintenance or upgrades. their artificial intelligence systems slowly losing coherence and tactical sophistication, while their mechanical components suffered wear and damage that could not be repaired without human oversight. The robots that had once represented cutting-edge military technology gradually devolved into malfunctioning automatons that posed as much danger to innocent survivors as to hostile raiders, their friend or foe identification systems corrupted by radiation, exposure, and software degradation. The defensive laser grid that had saved Las Vegas from nuclear destruction during the Great War gradually failed as power distribution systems developed faults, and targeting computers experienced cascade failures that could not be corrected without the kind of sophisticated maintenance that required conscious oversight and manual intervention. The weapons that had represented House's greatest technological triumph became dormant monuments to pre-war engineering excellence, their complex mechanisms sealed and silent, while the city they were designed to protect slowly declined toward the wasteland conditions that characterized most of the post-war world. The scavengers who penetrated Las Vegas during House's unconscious years represented exactly the kind of human threat that his defensive planning had anticipated, but without active management, his automated systems proved inadequate for distinguishing between legitimate survivors seeking shelter and predatory raiders intent on stripping the city of anything valuable. The Lucky 38 casino became a fortress by default rather than design, its sealed entrances and automated defenses keeping intruders at bay, while House slept unaware of the battles being fought in the streets outside his sanctuary. The tribal groups that established themselves in the ruins of Las Vegas during these decades brought both opportunity and danger for House's long-term objectives, as their presence provided potential human resources for future reconstruction efforts, while simultaneously creating the kind of social instability that might threaten any attempt to re-establish centralized authority when he eventually awakened. The tribes developed their own cultural traditions and power structures that would prove resistant to external control, though their numbers remained small enough that superior technology might eventually enable their integration into larger organizational frameworks. The new California Republic's gradual expansion eastward during the late 22nd and early 23rd centuries represented the kind of large-scale political development that House's mathematical models had predicted would eventually emerge as surviving populations reached critical mass and began establishing governmental structures capable of managing resources and territory beyond the local level. The Republic's growth brought both potential allies and potential threats to House's position, as their democratic institutions and expanding territory might either provide markets for his technological capabilities or challenge his authority over the Las Vegas region. The migration patterns that brought various groups through the Las Vegas area during House's period of unconsciousness created a complex tapestry of human settlement that would both complicate and facilitate his eventual awakening, as the presence of established communities provided potential sources of labor and expertise, while their competing claims to territory and resources would require careful management to prevent conflicts that might undermine his broader objectives for regional development and technological advancement. The gradual awakening that House experienced beginning in 2138 was not the sudden restoration of consciousness that he had originally planned, but a slow emergence from digital dreams that took months to complete, as his life support systems carefully rebalanced brain chemistry and neural activity, while his computer networks attempted to re-establish reliable connections with his conscious mind. The process was complicated by decades of system degradation and the accumulated effects of prolonged unconsciousness on both his biological and technological components. The world that greeted House's returning awareness was simultaneously familiar and alien, with Las Vegas recognizable in its basic geography and architecture, but transformed by decades of neglect, scavenging, and tribal occupation that had altered the city's character in ways that required extensive observation and analysis before he could develop appropriate strategies for reasserting control over his domain. The technological infrastructure that he had spent years developing lay in ruins or had been stripped away by scavengers, while new social structures had emerged that would need to be either incorporated into his plans or eliminated as obstacles to progress. The intelligence gathering that occupied House's first years of renewed consciousness revealed the extent to which the post-war world had developed according to patterns that his mathematical models had anticipated, with tribal societies emerging in areas where population density remained low, while more sophisticated governmental structures developed in regions where resources and security enabled larger-scale organization. The new California Republic represented exactly the kind of democratic expansion that he had predicted would eventually challenge his authority, while the various raider groups and tribal confederations provided both threats and opportunities for manipulation. The strategic assessment that House conducted during these years of observation and planning revealed that his position remained viable despite decades of neglect and system degradation. As Las Vegas retained geographical and resource advantages that could be leveraged to re-establish his influence, while the technological knowledge preserved in his computer systems, however corrupted, still exceeded anything available to potential competitors in the region. The key to successful re-emergence would be timing and careful management of relationships with the various factions that now claimed territory in what had once been his undisputed domain. The decision to remain hidden and inactive for additional decades reflected House's understanding that premature revelation of his survival might provoke responses from established powers that his degraded capabilities could not successfully counter, while continued observation would enable him to identify optimal timing for reasserting his authority when conditions favored success over merely announcing his continued existence to a world that had learned to function without him. The patience that House demonstrated during these additional decades of conscious waiting was testament to the psychological transformation that centuries of existence had produced in his thinking, as the urgent ambitions that had characterized his pre-war personality gave way to longer-term strategic perspectives that measured success in decades rather than years, while recognizing that premature action might destroy opportunities that careful timing could exploit to maximum advantage. The new California Republic scouts, who finally triggered House's emergence from hiding in 2274, represented exactly the kind of external pressure that his strategic planning had identified as optimal catalyst for reasserting his authority, as their presence at Hoover Dam created both opportunity for profitable cooperation and threat of territorial annexation that required immediate response to prevent loss of his most valuable strategic assets. The activation of his Securitron army that announced House's return to active participation in post-war politics was carefully choreographed to demonstrate technological superiority while avoiding unnecessary provocation of the NCR forces whose cooperation would be essential for his economic objectives, creating conditions for negotiation rather than immediate conflict, while establishing his credibility as a power broker capable of defending his interests through superior firepower and strategic positioning. The emergence from 2 centuries of forced patience marked not just House's return to conscious activity, but his transformation from pre-war industrialist to post-war political leader, with objectives that had evolved from personal enrichment to species preservation, while retaining the calculating intelligence and technological superiority that had enabled his survival through humanity's greatest catastrophe. The long sleep had ended, but the greatest challenges of his extraordinary existence lay ahead as he prepared to guide human civilization through its next crucial phase of development. The emergence of House's Securitron army from the Lucky 38 casino in 2274 marked not just his return to active politics, but the beginning of the most ambitious social engineering project in post-war history, the transformation of savage tribal societies into the sophisticated casino families that would become the foundation of New Vegas's economic miracle. The robotic sentinels that rolled through the ruins of Las Vegas carried more than weapons and surveillance equipment. They represented House's vision of how technology could be used to reshape human culture itself, converting raiders and nomads into partners in rebuilding civilization according to his mathematical principles. The tribal groups that House identified as potential recruits for his casino empire had survived 2 centuries of post-apocalyptic hardship through exactly the kinds of ruthless pragmatism and adaptive intelligence that he recognized as essential qualities for success in the new world he intended to create. These were not the desperate refugees or broken survivors that populated many wasteland settlements, but organized communities that had thrived in environments where weakness meant death, and only the most cunning and capable leaders could maintain group cohesion through decades of constant threat and scarcity. The chairmen, known in their pre-transformation existence as the Boot Riders, represented the kind of nomadic warrior culture that had emerged naturally from the harsh realities of wasteland, travel, and trade. Their society built around mobility, violence, and the kind of tribal loyalty that could survive the pressures that had destroyed larger and more complex social organizations. House recognized in their leader, Benny, the combination of ambition and intelligence that could be channeled into legitimate business operations while retaining the edge of controlled danger that would make his casino operations more exciting and profitable than conventional entertainment venues. The recruitment process that House used to bring the Boot Riders into his organization demonstrated his understanding that lasting transformation required appealing to existing cultural values rather than attempting to impose entirely alien behavioral patterns that would create psychological resistance and eventual rebellion. He offered them not just wealth and security, but the opportunity to become legends, to transform their reputation for dangerous competence into a more sophisticated form of power that would be respected throughout the post-war world. The education program that converted tribal raiders into casino operators was perhaps House's most remarkable achievement. In applied psychology, requiring him to preserve the essential characteristics that made these groups effective, while teaching them the complex social and business skills necessary for managing legitimate enterprises. The Boot Riders had to learn not just how to wear suits and speak properly, but how to channel their natural aggression into competitive business practices that would generate profits rather than simply eliminating rivals through violence. The Omatars presented House with perhaps his most challenging recruitment target. As their pre-transformation identity, as the Slitherkin was built around betrayal, deception, and predatory behavior that made them simultaneously valuable and dangerous as potential business partners. House understood that their expertise in manipulation and their complete lack of conventional moral constraints could be transformed into exactly the kind of ruthless business efficiency that would make their casino operations extraordinarily profitable, provided that their natural tendencies could be channeled in directions that served his broader objectives. The decision to recruit the Slitherkin, despite their obvious potential for betrayal, reflected House's calculation that their capabilities outweighed their risks, particularly since his technological superiority would enable him to monitor and control their activities in ways that made treachery difficult to execute successfully. He recognized that their immoral pragmatism was actually an asset in the kind of competitive entertainment industry he intended to establish, where success would require exactly the kind of calculated manipulation that the Slitherkin had perfected during their years as wasteland predators. The transformation of the Slitherkin into the Immerse required House to provide them with cultural templates that would channel their natural deceptive abilities into socially acceptable forms of competitive advantage, teaching them that the same skills they had used to rob and murder travelers could be applied to separating casino customers from their money through perfectly legal gambling operations. The transition was surprisingly smooth, as the tribe discovered that legitimate business provided better long-term profits than simple theft, while offering the additional satisfaction of social respectability. The White Glove Society represented House's most ambitious cultural transformation project, as their original identity as a cannibalistic tribe required not just behavioral modification, but fundamental psychological rehabilitation that would enable them to function in polite society without revealing their horrific past to customers who would be understandably disturbed to learn that their hosts had once consumed human flesh as a matter of course. The challenge was made more complex by the need to preserve the tribe's natural sophistication and attention to detail, while completely eliminating their dietary preferences. The cannibalistic practices that had characterized the White Gloves in their pre-transformation state were not simply matters of survival desperation, but cultural traditions that had developed elaborate rituals and social meanings around the consumption of human flesh, making their elimination a complex process of psychological and social engineering that required House to provide alternative sources of identity and purpose that would satisfy their need for exclusivity and superiority without resorting to their previous dietary habits. The recruitment strategy that House employed with the cannibalistic tribe involved appealing to their existing sense of cultural superiority and refinement, convincing them that their natural sophistication could be better expressed through the management of an exclusive resort that catered to the wasteland's most elite clientele, rather than through the consumption of other human beings. He provided them with cultural education that emphasized the connection between fine dining and social status, teaching them that controlling access to luxury experiences was a more refined form of power than simply eating one's enemies. The contracts that House negotiated with each of the three tribal groups were masterpieces of legal engineering that preserved their autonomy while ensuring their loyalty, creating binding agreements that provided substantial benefits for compliance while making defection economically catastrophic and practically impossible. The terms were structured to appeal to each tribe's specific cultural values and psychological needs, while establishing clear boundaries and expectations that would prevent conflicts between the groups that might undermine the broader project of rebuilding Las Vegas. The renovation of the casinos that would house the three families required House to balance historical preservation with modern functionality, creating entertainment venues that would appeal to post-war sensibilities while incorporating the technological innovations that would give his establishments competitive advantages over any potential rivals. The Lucky 38 remained his personal headquarters and most exclusive venue, while the Tops, Ultra Luxe, and Gomorrah were designed to showcase different aspects of pre-war sophistication while accommodating the cultural preferences of their respective tribal operators. The training programs that transformed tribal warriors into casino staff represented an extraordinary feat of adult education, requiring House to develop curricula that could teach complex hospitality and business skills to individuals whose previous experience had been limited to survival, warfare, and predation. The process required months of intensive instruction in everything from basic mathematics and literacy to advanced psychology and customer service, with specialized modules designed to address the unique challenges that each tribal group would face in their transition to legitimate business operations. The economic model that House established for New Vegas was built around the principle that entertainment and vice could generate more sustainable wealth than traditional resource extraction or manufacturing, particularly in a post-war environment where both raw materials and industrial infrastructure remained scarce, while human desires for escapism and luxury had only intensified during the difficult years of Reconstruction. The casino economy would provide employment for hundreds of workers while generating tax revenue and trade income that could fund further development projects. The security arrangements that House implemented to protect his investment in the three families were necessarily complex, as he needed to monitor groups with histories of violence and betrayal, while avoiding the kind of obvious surveillance that might provoke rebellion or undermine the atmosphere of sophisticated entertainment that his establishments were designed to provide. The Securitron patrols were supplemented by human security personnel drawn from reliable sources, creating layered protection that could respond to both external threats and internal conflicts. The new California Republic's arrival at Hoover Dam in 2274 represented exactly the kind of external pressure that House had calculated would eventually require his intervention in regional politics, as the Republic's expansion eastward threatened to overwhelm the fragile tribal balance that he had established, while simultaneously providing opportunities for profitable cooperation if managed correctly. The Republic's military and economic power could either destroy his carefully constructed casino empire or provide the customer base necessary for its expansion and long-term success. The negotiations that led to the Treaty of New Vegas demonstrated House's diplomatic skills and his understanding that sustainable power required legitimate recognition from external authorities rather than simple military dominance over local populations. The agreement that granted the Republic access to Hoover Dam's electricity in exchange for recognition of New Vegas's independence as a free economic zone created the foundation for mutually beneficial relationships, while GOMS establishing legal frameworks that would protect House's interests from future territorial expansion by democratic governments. The economic boom that followed the establishment of the New Vegas Strip as a legitimate entertainment destination exceeded even House's optimistic projections, as Republic soldiers and civilians flocked to the casinos, seeking the kinds of sophisticated entertainment that had been unavailable anywhere in the post-war world. The revenue streams generated by gambling, dining, and accommodation services provided the financial resources necessary for continued expansion and technological development, while demonstrating the viability of House's vision for post-war economic reconstruction. The cultural impact of the Strip's success extended far beyond its immediate economic benefits, as New Vegas became a symbol of what could be achieved when pre-war knowledge and technology were combined with post-war adaptability and determination. The city represented proof that human civilization could not only recover from nuclear devastation, but achieve new heights of sophistication and prosperity through intelligent planning and strategic cooperation between different groups and factions. The three families' evolution from savage tribes to sophisticated business operators was perhaps the most remarkable transformation in post-war history, demonstrating that human nature was sufficiently malleable to permit radical behavioral changes when appropriate incentives and support systems were provided. The success of this social engineering project validated House's belief that technology and superior intelligence could overcome even the most challenging cultural and psychological obstacles to progress and development. The stability that House achieved through his careful balance of tribal autonomy and technological control created conditions that attracted additional investment and settlement to the Las Vegas region. as traders, craftsmen, and service providers recognized the opportunities available in a secure environment where rule of law was enforced through superior firepower rather than democratic consensus. The Strip became the economic heart of a larger regional economy that extended House's influence far beyond the immediate casino district. The long-term sustainability of House's casino empire depended not just on continued cooperation from the three families, but on his ability to manage the complex relationships between tribal autonomy, republic interests, and his own technological advantages in ways that would prevent any single factor from overwhelming the careful balance that made the entire system functional. The mathematical precision that had enabled him to predict the Great War would be equally essential for navigating the political and economic challenges that success would inevitably create. The platinum chip that had haunted Robert House's dreams for 2 centuries lay buried beneath tons of radioactive debris in the ruins of Sunnyvale, its sophisticated programming intact but utterly inaccessible to the man whose survival and ultimate triumph depended entirely upon its recovery and installation. The device represented both salvation and torment, close enough to Las Vegas to theoretically be within reach, yet separated by enough distance and obstacles to make its retrieval one of the most challenging logistical operations in the post-war wasteland, requiring resources and coordination that exceeded the capabilities of most surviving organizations. The search for the platinum chip became House's primary obsession from the moment his consciousness fully returned, and his analysis of system failures revealed the exact nature of what had gone wrong during those crucial 20 hours, when the Great War began ahead of his calculated schedule. Every Securitron patrol, every intelligence-gathering operation, every contact with wasteland scavengers and traders was ultimately directed toward the single goal of locating and recovering the small device that contained the operating system upgrades necessary to transform his degraded defensive capabilities back into the technological superiority that had once saved Las Vegas from nuclear annihilation. The mathematical precision that House applied to the search operation reflected his understanding that random exploration would be insufficient to locate a device as small as the platinum chip within the vast area of radioactive wasteland that surrounded the Sunnyvale ruins, requiring systematic grid searches coordinated with probability analysis based on blast patterns, debris distribution, and the likely survival characteristics of the chip's protective casing. The search parameters had to account for the possibility that the device had been moved by scavengers, buried by shifting rubble, or damaged beyond recognition by radiation exposure over the intervening centuries. The financial resources that House dedicated to the platinum chip recovery effort were enormous, reflecting both his desperate need for the device and his calculation that no amount of caps would be excessive if it enabled him to regain full operational capability for his technological systems. Scavenger teams throughout the wasteland received standing offers for any pre-war technology that matched the chip's description, while prospectors were hired to conduct systematic excavations in areas where House's analysis suggested the device might have come to rest after the nuclear bombardment. The security measures that House implemented around the search operation were necessarily complex, as the chip's importance made it a target for theft or sabotage by any faction that understood its significance to his continued dominance over the Las Vegas region. The search teams operated under cover stories about general salvage operations, while the true nature of their mission was concealed through compartmentalized information sharing that prevented any individual contractor from understanding the full scope of what they were seeking or why it was so valuable to their mysterious employer. The false leads and disappointing discoveries that characterized the early years of the search operation tested House's patience, while demonstrating the extraordinary difficulty of locating specific objects in a post-war landscape where 2 centuries of scavenging, environmental damage, and territorial conflicts had scattered the remnants of pre-war civilization across thousands of square miles of hostile terrain. Each promising report was followed by careful analysis and often dangerous recovery expeditions that yielded nothing more valuable than common electronic components or worthless metal fragments. The breakthrough that finally located the platinum chip came not from House's systematic search operations, but from pure chance. As a scavenger team working an unrelated salvage contract stumbled upon the device while excavating a collapsed building in the Sunnyvale ruins during the year 2281. The discovery represented both vindication of House's persistent search efforts and cruel irony, as the chip had been within relatively easy reach for decades, while he expended enormous resources searching in locations that his mathematical analysis had identified as more probable repositories. The authentication process that confirmed the recovered device was indeed House's long-lost platinum chip required sophisticated technical analysis to verify that the sophisticated programming remained intact and that the base for blank protective casing had successfully preserved the delicate circuitry from radiation damage and environmental contamination. The verification procedures were conducted in the most secure facilities available to House, with multiple redundant testing protocols designed to prevent any possibility of mistake or deception that might lead him to install a damaged or counterfeit device. The strategic planning that House conducted for the chip's delivery to Las Vegas reflected his hard-earned understanding that even the most carefully designed operations could be compromised by unexpected variables, requiring contingency plans and security measures that would ensure successful completion despite any foreseeable complications or hostile interference. The lessons learned from his pre-war miscalculation about timing would not be repeated, as he implemented multiple backup systems and alternative delivery routes that could compensate for almost any conceivable delay or disruption. The courier network that House established for the platinum chip's transportation represented one of the most sophisticated deception operations in post-war history, using multiple simultaneous deliveries to obscure the true location of the valuable device, while creating false targets that would distract potential interceptors and reduce the likelihood of successful theft or sabotage. The psychological warfare aspects of this strategy were as important as the physical security measures, as the uncertainty about which courier carried the real chip would force potential enemies to divide their resources across multiple targets. The selection of Courier 6 as the primary delivery agent was based on careful analysis of available personnel and route security assessments that identified this individual as having the optimal combination of reliability, combat capability, and lack of obvious connections to House's organization that would make interception less likely. The courier's proven track record of successful deliveries through hostile territory provided additional confidence that the mission would be completed, despite the obvious dangers inherent in transporting such valuable cargo through the politically unstable Mojave wasteland. The decoy operations that accompanied the real delivery were designed to appear sufficiently authentic to fool casual observation, while containing enough valuable materials to make their interception worthwhile for raiders or competing factions who might discover the deception only after committing resources to capturing what they believed was the primary target. The psychological impact of successful decoy captures would reinforce the effectiveness of House's security measures while providing valuable intelligence about hostile capabilities and intentions. The route planning that determined Courier 6's path toward Las Vegas incorporated detailed analysis of territorial boundaries, faction, relationships, and known hazard zones that might compromise the mission's success through hostile action, environmental dangers, or simple mechanical failure of the courier's transportation systems. The selected route balanced speed against security, choosing paths that minimized exposure to major population centers, while providing adequate resupply opportunities and emergency shelter options. The communication protocols established for monitoring the delivery's progress used coded transmissions and scheduled check-ins that would alert House to any deviations from planned timing or routing, while providing sufficient operational security to prevent hostile interception of sensitive information about the mission's true nature or strategic importance. The monitoring systems were designed to detect problems early enough to enable corrective action, while maintaining plausible deniability about House's involvement in the operation. The betrayal that shattered House's carefully constructed delivery plan came not from external enemies or random wasteland hazards, but from within his own organization, as Benny, leader of the chairman and one of his most trusted lieutenants, had discovered the chip's existence and significance through unauthorized access to restricted information systems. The discovery of House's dependence on the device created an irresistible opportunity for someone whose ambition had always exceeded his loyalty, providing the means to potentially overthrow his patron and claim independent control over New Vegas. The intelligence leak that enabled Benny's interception of the courier came through Yes Man, a Securitron whose programming had been modified to provide unrestricted access to House's data systems in apparent violation of multiple security protocols that should have prevented such unauthorized information sharing. The compromise represented either a catastrophic failure in House's cybersecurity measures or deliberate sabotage by someone with administrative access to his most sensitive systems, creating vulnerabilities that extended far beyond the immediate threat to the platinum chip delivery. The ambush at Goodspring Cemetery demonstrated Benny's understanding that successful theft of the platinum chip required not just interception but elimination of witnesses who might report the crime to House's intelligence network, making murder a necessary component of his plan to acquire the device while maintaining plausible deniability about his role in its disappearance. The location chosen for the ambush was strategically sound, providing isolation from potential witnesses while offering multiple escape routes if the operation encountered unexpected complications. The execution of Courier 6 was intended to be the final component of Benny's theft operation, eliminating the only person who could definitively connect him to the platinum chip's disappearance, while creating a false narrative about random wasteland violence that would misdirect House's inevitable investigation into alternative explanations that did not implicate his trusted lieutenant. The psychological impact of betrayal by someone he had elevated from savage tribalism to sophisticated leadership would prove as devastating to House as the loss of the chip itself. The survival of Courier 6, despite suffering what should have been fatal gunshot wounds, represented the kind of random variable that no amount of strategic planning could anticipate or prevent, creating an unexpected complication in Benny's otherwise well-executed theft operation that would eventually provide House with the means to recover both his platinum chip and exact appropriate revenge for the betrayal that had nearly destroyed his plans for technological supremacy over the Mojave region. The intelligence network that House had established throughout the wasteland included Victor, a Securitron operating under deep cover in Goodsprings, whose primary mission was monitoring potential threats to House's interests while maintaining the appearance of a harmless local resident with no obvious connections to the new Vegas power structure. Victor's presence at the scene of the ambush provided House with immediate intelligence about the attack, while enabling covert assistance to the wounded courier, whose survival was essential for identifying the perpetrators. The medical intervention that saved Courier 6's life was facilitated by Victor's covert assistance and the expertise of Doc Mitchell, whose surgical skills were adequate to treat gunshot wounds that would have been fatal without immediate professional attention. The recovery process provided House with time to analyze the intelligence gathered from the ambush site while planning his response to what he now understood was deliberate betrayal by someone with inside knowledge of his most sensitive operations. The investigation that House conducted into the platinum chips theft revealed the full extent of Benny's treachery, while exposing security vulnerabilities in his organization that would require systematic correction to prevent similar betrayals in the future. The evidence pointed not just to theft but to long-term planning for rebellion, suggesting that Benny's ambitions had been developing for months or years, while he maintained his facade of loyalty and cooperation with House's broader objectives for regional development. The strategic response that House developed to address Benny's betrayal balanced the need for appropriate punishment against the practical requirements of maintaining stability among the three families, whose continued cooperation was essential for New Vegas's economic prosperity and political independence. The solution would require careful timing and plausible deniability that would eliminate the traitor while preserving the organizational structure that had made the casino empire successful. The invitation that House extended to Courier 6 represented both opportunity for revenge and calculated risk, as bringing the wounded courier into his inner circle would provide access to someone with obvious motivation to pursue Benny, while creating potential complications if the courier's agenda extended beyond simple retaliation for the perms. Attempted murder. The psychological dynamics of the situation suggested that the courier's desire for justice could be channeled in directions that served House's broader interests, while satisfying personal needs for closure and revenge. The convergence of multiple faction interests on the platinum chips recovery created a complex strategic environment where House's objectives intersected with the territorial ambitions of the new California Republic, the expansionist goals of Caesar's Legion, and various smaller groups whose involvement would determine whether the Mojave's future would be shaped by technological superiority, democratic governance, totalitarian conquest, or anarchic fragmentation that served no one's long-term interests. The Second Battle of Hoover Dam loomed over the Mojave wasteland like a gathering storm, its inevitability recognized by every major faction, despite their public proclamations of peaceful intentions and diplomatic solutions that fooled no one who understood the mathematical realities of territorial competition and resource scarcity in the post-war world. Robert House observed the mounting tensions from his penthouse office in the Lucky 38, calculating probabilities and adjusting strategic plans, while the various powers positioned themselves for what would determine the region's political structure for generations to come. The new California Republic's military buildup around the dam represented exactly the kind of democratic imperialism that House had predicted would eventually threaten his carefully constructed independence, as the Republic's leadership convinced themselves that annexing Nevada was both strategically necessary and morally justified, despite their lack of legitimate claim to territory that had been effectively governed by House's technological superiority for years. The democratic rhetoric that accompanied their preparations could not disguise the simple reality that they wanted House's resources without paying the negotiated prices that had made their previous relationship profitable for both parties. The Legion's approach from the east brought with it the specter of totalitarian conquest that would sweep away every vestige of individual freedom and technological progress that House had worked to preserve and develop, replacing his vision of guided human advancement with Caesar's brutal reimagining of classical antiquity that treated modern citizens as slaves. and viewed technological innovation as corruption to be eliminated rather than tools to be mastered. The contrast between House's calculated autocracy and Caesar's savage despotism represented fundamentally different approaches to post-war governance that could not coexist within the same territorial boundaries. The courier who had survived Benny's treachery at Goodsprings Cemetery now stood at the center of these converging forces, possessed of unique capabilities and strategic positioning that made their allegiance the decisive factor in determining which vision of the future would prevail in the Mojave conflict. House's analysis of the courier's psychological profile and demonstrated capabilities suggested someone whose combination of combat skills, strategic thinking, and apparent moral flexibility made them an ideal agent for implementing whatever political solution they chose to support. The invitation that House extended to the courier represented both calculated risk and strategic necessity, as bringing someone with such obvious potential for independent action into his inner circle created opportunities for manipulation, while simultaneously exposing his plans and vulnerabilities to someone whose ultimate loyalties remained uncertain. The psychological dynamics of their relationship would be crucial for determining whether the courier's obvious desire for revenge against Benny could be channeled into broader support for House's vision of technological autocracy. The Brotherhood of Steel's presence in the Mojave added another variable to the strategic equation, as their fanatical dedication to hoarding pre-war technology made them natural enemies of House's philosophy of technological development and practical application, while their military capabilities and underground installations made them dangerous adversaries who could not be ignored or dismissed as irrelevant to the broader conflict's outcome. House's analysis of their leadership structure and tactical doctrines suggested that peaceful coexistence would be impossible, despite their relatively small numbers and defensive posture. The challenge that the Brotherhood represented was not their immediate military threat, which House's Securitron army could eventually overcome through superior numbers and technological advantages, but their ideological opposition to his fundamental approach to post-war recovery and development. Their belief that advanced technology should be preserved but not utilized conflicted directly with House's conviction that human progress required active innovation and practical application of scientific knowledge, rather than passive guardianship of artifacts from a vanished civilization. The ultimatum that House presented regarding the Brotherhood's fate reflected his understanding that some conflicts could not be resolved through negotiation or compromise, requiring decisive action to eliminate obstacles that would perpetually threaten his long-term objectives regardless of temporary truces or apparent accommodations. The mathematical certainty of future conflict made preemptive action more efficient than prolonged diplomatic efforts that would ultimately fail while consuming resources better devoted to productive activities. The Kings of Freeside presented a different but equally significant challenge to House's authority, as their grassroots legitimacy and community support made them natural rivals for the loyalty of Las Vegas's population, while their independence from his direct control created potential complications for implementing unified policies across the region. The charismatic leadership and social welfare programs that had earned the Kings their popular support could either be incorporated into House's broader governance structure or eliminated as competing sources of political authority. The decision regarding Freeside's future governance would test House's commitment to his stated principles of minimal interference in citizens' private affairs, as the King's autonomous administration of their territory represented exactly the kind of local self-determination that his philosophy claimed to support, while their practical independence from his authority created strategic vulnerabilities that might be exploited by hostile factions or internal dissidents seeking to undermine his regional dominance. The complexity of managing relationships with both the king's and Freeside's general population required House to balance immediate security concerns against long-term legitimacy considerations, as heavy-handed suppression of popular local leadership would create resentment and resistance that might prove more costly than the threats posed by autonomous governance of areas that were not directly essential to his core economic and military operations. The mathematics of social control suggested that voluntary cooperation was more sustainable than enforced compliance when managing large civilian populations. The economic implications of the approaching conflict extended far beyond immediate military costs to encompass the broader question of how victory would be consolidated into lasting prosperity and stability for the Mojave region, as different outcomes would create vastly different opportunities for trade, development, and technological advancement depending on which faction's governing philosophy ultimately prevailed. House's projections indicated that his independent victory would maximize long-term economic growth while minimizing the social disruption that would accompany either NCR, annexation, or Legion conquest. The technological advantages that House possessed through his Securitron army and defensive systems provided significant military benefits, but their full potential could only be realized through the operating system upgrades contained in the platinum chip that Benny's theft had made temporarily inaccessible, creating a crucial timing element in strategic planning that required the chip's recovery before major military operations could be undertaken with confidence of success. The delay caused by Benny's betrayal had compressed House's decision-making timeline while increasing the risks associated with every available course of action. The diplomatic overtures that House made to various faction leaders reflected his preference for achieving objectives through negotiation and economic incentives rather than purely military solutions, though his willingness to resort to force when necessary was clearly established through his ultimatums regarding the Brotherhood and his contingency plans for dealing with uncooperative local authorities. The combination of technological superiority and reasonable terms for cooperation provided optimal conditions for voluntary compliance with his regional governance objectives. The courier's unique position as someone with access to all major faction leadership created unprecedented opportunities for intelligence gathering and strategic manipulation that could potentially alter the conflict's outcome, regardless of the military balance between competing forces, as information advantages and diplomatic intervention at crucial moments might prevent costly battles while achieving political objectives through more elegant and sustainable methods than pure conquest could provide. The moral calculations that accompanied House's strategic planning revealed the tension between his utilitarian approach to governance and the human costs that would inevitably result from pursuing his vision of technological progress and regional stability, as even optimal outcomes would require eliminating opposition groups whose resistance was based on legitimate concerns about autocratic governance and the concentration of power in the hands of someone who was accountable to no democratic institutions or popular oversight mechanisms. The psychological profile that House developed for the courier suggested someone whose decision-making process combined pragmatic assessment of available options with personal moral considerations that might not align with purely strategic calculations, creating uncertainty about which factors would ultimately determine their allegiance when forced to choose between competing visions of the Mojave's political future. The couriers' demonstrated independence and combat capability made them valuable allies, but potentially dangerous enemies, depending on how their moral reasoning evaluated House's methods and objectives. The intelligence networks that House had established throughout the Mojave provided comprehensive monitoring of faction movements and strategic developments, but the approaching conflict's complexity created information overload that required careful analysis to distinguish significant trends from tactical deceptions and routine military preparations, as all sides were simultaneously attempting to gather intelligence while concealing their true intentions and capabilities from potential adversaries. The economic disruption that accompanied military preparations affected all aspects of regional commerce and civilian life. As trade routes became dangerous, supply chains were interrupted by military movements, and productive activities were subordinated to wartime preparations that consumed resources without generating the wealth necessary for long-term prosperity and development. House's calculations indicated that prolonged conflict would be economically devastating regardless of its ultimate outcome, making swift resolution essential for preserving the foundations of post-war recovery. The Legion's approach to the conflict represented not merely territorial expansion, but civilizational transformation that would eliminate every aspect of modern society that House considered essential for human progress, replacing technological innovation with classical nostalgia, individual freedom with collective slavery, and economic development with militaristic resource extraction that would impoverish the region while destroying its potential for contributing to humanity's long-term advancement beyond the immediate challenges of post-war survival. The NCR's democratic rhetoric concealed imperialist ambitions that would subject the Mojave to the same bureaucratic inefficiency and political corruption that had characterized the Republic's administration of other annexed territories, replacing House's efficient autocracy with committee governance and regulatory obstacles that would stifle innovation while consuming resources through administrative overhead that served no productive purpose beyond providing employment for bureaucrats whose primary qualification was political loyalty rather than competence. The independent option that some factions advocated would create power vacuum conditions that historically led to anarchic violence and economic collapse, as competing groups struggled for dominance without the unifying authority necessary for coordinating regional development projects or maintaining the security conditions that enabled trade and civilian prosperity. House's analysis indicated that independence without strong leadership was merely delayed conquest by whoever possessed sufficient military capability to impose order through force. The Courier's ultimate decision would determine not just the immediate conflict's outcome, but the trajectory of human development in the American Southwest for potentially centuries to come, as the institutional structures and governing philosophies established during this crucial period would shape economic opportunities, technological advancement, and social organization in ways that would either accelerate or retard humanity's recovery from nuclear devastation, while establishing precedents for addressing similar conflicts in other regions, where competing factions sought to fill governmental vacuums left by the old world's destruction. The philosophical foundations that underpinned Robert House's vision for post-war governance extended far beyond simple autocracy into a comprehensive theory of human development that challenged every assumption about democracy, individual rights, and the proper relationship between technological capability and political authority that had characterized pre-war American society. His approach to ruling New Vegas represented not merely personal ambition, but a calculated experiment in whether superior intelligence and technological resources could create more prosperous and stable communities than the democratic institutions that had ultimately led humanity to nuclear self-destruction. The mathematical frameworks that House applied to social organization treated human societies as complex systems whose optimal configuration could be determined through rigorous analysis of historical patterns, economic incentives, and behavioral psychology, rather than through the emotional preferences and ideological commitments that characterize democratic decision-making processes. His calculations suggested that most political problems had objectively correct solutions that could be identified through proper analytical methods, while democratic governance systematically selected suboptimal policies because voters lacked the information and expertise necessary for making rational choices about complex issues. The autocratic model that House implemented in New Vegas was designed to maximize economic efficiency and technological progress, while minimizing the social conflicts and resource waste that he identified as inevitable consequences of democratic governance, particularly in post-war conditions where survival margins were narrow and strategic mistakes could have catastrophic consequences for entire communities. His approach combined centralized decision-making with market mechanisms that rewarded productive behavior while punishing activities that diverted resources from essential development projects. The comparison between House's governance philosophy and the developmental state model that had achieved remarkable success in places like Singapore during the pre-war period revealed striking similarities in their emphasis on technocratic leadership, long-term strategic planning, and the subordination of political participation to economic development objectives. Both approaches assumed that rapid modernization required strong executive authority capable of implementing comprehensive policies without the delays and compromises that characterize democratic legislative processes. The economic principles that guided House's administration of New Vegas emphasized the creation of competitive advantages through technological innovation and strategic positioning, rather than through the resource extraction or manufacturing activities that had characterized most pre-war economic development, recognizing that post-war conditions made traditional industrial development impossible, while creating new opportunities for service-based economies that could thrive despite limited physical infrastructure and scarce raw materials. The tourism and entertainment industries that House developed as the foundation of New Vegas's economy represented a sophisticated understanding of post-war consumer psychology and the human need for escapism and luxury, experiences that could justify premium pricing, even when basic necessities remained scarce throughout most of the wasteland. The casino operations generated enormous profit margins while providing employment opportunities for hundreds of workers whose alternative prospects in the harsh post-war environment would have been far less favorable. The revenue streams that House derived from his entertainment empire enabled him to maintain the technological infrastructure and security forces necessary for protecting New Vegas from external threats, while funding continued research and development projects that would expand his competitive advantages over potential rivals who lacked access to similar financial resources or technical expertise. The economic model was deliberately designed to be self-reinforcing, with success generating the resources necessary for continued expansion and improvement. The water and electricity that House controlled through his dominance of Hoover Dam represented strategic resources whose scarcity throughout the post-war Southwest gave him enormous leverage over neighboring territories and potential trading partners, enabling him to extract favorable terms for commercial agreements, while demonstrating the practical benefits of his technological and organizational superiority. The pricing structure he established for these essential commodities reflected both their genuine scarcity value and his strategic need to generate revenue for continued operations. The criticism that House's resource pricing represented exploitation of desperate communities failed to account for the massive infrastructure investments and ongoing maintenance costs required to keep Hoover Dam operational in post-war conditions. as well as the security expenses necessary for protecting these facilities from raiders, hostile factions, and environmental hazards that posed constant threats to the technological systems that made electricity and water distribution possible across the dangerous wasteland environment. The long-term development plans that House outlined for New Vegas extended far beyond immediate post-war recovery to encompass his vision for humanity's eventual expansion beyond Earth itself, with space colonization representing the ultimate solution to the resource scarcity and territorial conflicts that had led to nuclear war in the first place. His timeline for achieving these objectives required sustained economic growth and technological advancement that could only be maintained through the kind of focused leadership that democratic governance was structurally incapable of providing. The 20-year projection for reigniting high-technology development sectors reflected House's understanding that post-war scientific progress would require coordinated efforts to rebuild educational institutions, research facilities, and manufacturing capabilities that had been destroyed during the nuclear exchange, while simultaneously training new generations of scientists and engineers who could continue advancing human knowledge despite the enormous challenges posed by radiation, resource scarcity, and social instability. The 50-year timeline for achieving orbital capabilities demonstrated House's recognition that space technology required not just scientific knowledge, but massive industrial infrastructure and financial resources that could only be accumulated through decades of sustained economic growth and careful resource allocation, making democratic governance with its short-term electoral cycles and competing interest groups fundamentally unsuitable for managing such long-term projects that required consistent policy implementation across multiple generations. The century-long vision for interstellar colonization represented House's ultimate answer to the existential risks that threatened human survival on a planet where nuclear weapons and other destructive technologies made extinction increasingly probable with each passing generation, as expanding beyond Earth would ensure that local catastrophes could not eliminate the entire species, regardless of what mistakes future leaders might make or what natural disasters might occur. The critique of democratic governance that House offered to justify his autocratic approach was based on his analysis of how democratic institutions had failed to prevent the Great War, despite having access to the same information about resource depletion and international tensions that had enabled him to predict the nuclear exchange with mathematical precision. The structural incentives of democratic politics rewarded short-term popularity over long-term planning, making it impossible for elected leaders to implement the difficult policies necessary for avoiding catastrophic outcomes. The moral framework that House used to justify concentrating enormous power in his own hands was utilitarian rather than rights-based, arguing that the greatest good for the greatest number required accepting temporary restrictions on individual freedom in exchange for the security and prosperity that only superior leadership could provide. His claim to moral legitimacy was based on results rather than consent, with the obvious success of New Vegas compared to the poverty and chaos that characterized most post-war communities, serving as evidence that his methods produced better outcomes than alternative approaches. The psychological analysis that House conducted of his own motivations and decision-making processes was intended to demonstrate that he was immune to the corruption and abuse of power that had historically characterized autocratic rulers. As his technological integration and mathematical approach to problem-solving supposedly eliminated the emotional and personal considerations that led other dictators to prioritize their own interests over their subjects' welfare. His claim that he was impervious to corrupting ambitions reflected his belief that superior intelligence and technological capabilities could transcend normal human limitations. The technological determinism that characterized House's worldview assumed that superior tools and analytical methods could solve social and political problems that had plagued human societies throughout history, with artificial intelligence and computer-assisted decision-making providing more reliable guidance than the emotional reasoning and ideological commitments that influenced human leaders in both democratic and autocratic systems. This philosophy justified concentrating power in the hands of someone who could effectively merge human intelligence with technological capabilities. The paternalistic aspects of House's governance philosophy were evident in his assumption that most people were incapable of making rational decisions about complex policy issues, requiring guidance from those with superior knowledge and analytical capabilities who could identify optimal solutions that served everyone's long-term interests, even when those solutions contradicted popular preferences or immédiat désir. This approach treated citizens as beneficiaries rather than participants in the political process. The efficiency arguments that House made for autocratic governance were based on his observation that democratic decision-making processes consumed enormous amounts of time and resources, while frequently producing suboptimal policies that satisfied no one completely, whereas centralized authority could implement comprehensive solutions quickly and consistently without the delays and compromises that characterized legislative governance. The mathematical precision of his approach supposedly eliminated the waste and inefficiency that democratic politics created through its emphasis on consensus building and interest group accommodation. The criticism that House's system provided no mechanisms for peaceful leadership change or democratic accountability was dismissed through his argument that his technological integration made him effectively immortal, eliminating the succession problems that had historically destabilized autocratic governments, while ensuring continuity of leadership across the extended timeframes necessary for implementing long-term development projects. His personal survival was thus presented as essential for maintaining the political stability that made progress possible. The comparison between House's New Vegas and other post-war communities provided empirical evidence for evaluating his claims about the superiority of autocratic governance, as the obvious prosperity and security of the Strip contrasted sharply with the poverty, violence, and instability that characterized most settlements, operating under more democratic or anarchic arrangements. The material success of his experiment in technocratic authoritarianism served as practical validation for his theoretical arguments about optimal governance structures. The international implications of House's success in New Vegas extended beyond local politics to influence broader discussions about post-war reconstruction and the appropriate balance between individual freedom and collective security in societies where traditional governmental institutions had been destroyed by nuclear devastation. His model provided a template that other surviving communities might adopt, potentially spreading autocratic governance throughout the post-war world, as democratic alternatives proved inadequate for managing the challenges of reconstruction and development. The environmental considerations that House incorporated into his long-term planning reflected his understanding that post-war conditions required more careful resource management and environmental protection than had characterized pre-war industrial development, as the nuclear devastation had created ecological fragility that made traditional approaches to economic growth potentially suicidal. His emphasis on sustainable development and technological solutions to environmental problems represented a more sophisticated approach to balancing human needs with ecological constraints. The cultural implications of House's governance philosophy extended beyond political and economic considerations to encompass questions about human identity and social organization in a world where traditional communities and institutions had been largely destroyed by nuclear war. His approach to managing the three families demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of using superior technology and strategic thinking to reshape human societies according to rational principles rather than historical traditions or emotional attachments. The ultimate test of House's vision for post-war governance would come not from immediate military conflicts or economic challenges, but from its long-term sustainability and ability to adapt to changing circumstances without the democratic mechanisms that enabled other political systems to evolve peacefully in response to new conditions and popular demands. The mathematical precision that characterized his approach might prove inadequate for managing the unpredictable human elements that determined whether any political system could maintain legitimacy and effectiveness across the generations required for achieving his ambitious objectives for human development and interstellar expansion. Whether savior or despot, visionary or tyrant, Robert House remains one of the wasteland's most complex figures. His story asks fundamental questions about leadership, progress, and the price of survival in a world stripped of old certainties. As you drift towards sleep, consider the weight of his choices, the lives saved by his foresight, the freedoms curtailed by his control, the future he promises at humanity's crossroads. In dreams, perhaps, we can imagine what might have been, what could still be, in a world where one man's calculations determine the fate of thousands. Rest now, knowing that somewhere in the Mojave, the house still stands, and the house always wins. Sweet dreams, wanderer.